Welcome everybody to this introduction for the subject legal research. I'm going to try and do 4 things in this introduction. I'm going to start off with an introduction to myself, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm then going to talk about the skills that this subject addresses. Then I'm going to focus broadly on the assignment task, how you're going to be assessed. And finally, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on one form of that assessment, which of course is the area of law reform. Okay, so to begin with, I've been a legal academic for well over 25 years. And I guess what I can say about that, and what I like to say about that, is that that has been a great privilege to be a legal academic. I've really, really enjoyed my time studying and researching and writing about the law. It's fascinating to do that. The areas of law that I've looked at are quite varied, maybe. I haven't done a lot of commercial law. So I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about those. My primary focus has always been in the area of criminal law. I've always, from the time I went to law school in Tasmania, loved studying, researching and teaching criminal law. To some extent, I think that's probably was inspired by 2 things. One was I had a very, very quirky criminal law lecturer at law school who used to go down to the yacht club for lunch every day and drink a couple of either beers or a couple of wine, and then would come back to class and teach us. And he'd become very animated and passionate about his subject. He also had a tendency to smell of alcohol and to spit at anybody that had the misfortune of sitting in the first couple of rows of the lecture theatre. And in a COVID world, that seemed like a quite disgusting thing, but he was rather inspirational. Of course, the other thing that made me interested in it is the subject matter itself. It's a really interesting area of the law. I mean, it's all about things like drugs, sex, and death, and they are engaging. So I guess I had the privilege of researching these things, teaching these things, without having to deal with those that were responsible for perpetration of the offences involved. So being an academic in that respect has its perks. Another area, one that's particularly pertinent for you guys, is that of human rights. I have researched and taught human rights for a long time. Human rights is a great area of the law. Human rights can be characterized primarily as a battle by the population or the people against the establishment to ensure that their rights are protected. I guess, what do I mean by that? Well, you take, for example, the right not to be tortured or subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment. That means that if you have that right not to be tortured, governments can't use that as a means for suppressing its population. So it takes away the power of government, if you like. That applies to all sorts of things, like the prohibition on slavery, for example, and servitude. The prohibition in recent times means that governments like Australian government have to take action about the widespread use of mostly Asian, what you call sex slaves, perhaps is maybe a lot of them aren't sex slaves, but some of them are, and who are at least living in servitude or debt bondage, or something that's quite often referred to as a modern form of slavery. And that's a great thing, that the government has been forced to finally take some action to protect these rather vulnerable individuals. Other things, for example, governments have been forced to, because of human rights law, is taking actions to ensure that young girls aren't removed from our jurisdiction. It was purely human rights organisations, or the human rights bodies from the UN that sort of put pressure on Australia to do this, to stop them allowing people to be taken to other countries where they might be subjected to or would be subjected to female genital mutilation, for example. So again, it made Australia act to protect the interests of particularly vulnerable individuals. Look, the list goes on and on. You may look at sort of sex discrimination, race discrimination, etc. These are all sorts of areas where governments are forced to respond. Okay, international law, another area that I've had a long involvement with. This is primarily concerned with the relationship between states, nation states, that is. I'm not talking about the federation states, I'm talking about countries. But in international law, you refer to those as states. It's about how they interact with each other. Things like when states can go to war and the rules that govern what happens when they are in war against each other. What that's referred to as international humanitarian law. It's a form of international law. There's also international laws about things like acquiring territory. Things like states don't acquire a lot of territory anymore, but the main way they do it is in terms of sea territory. So it is international law that governs things like how wide a state's territorial sea can be, how wide its exclusive economic zone, its rights to claim a continental shelf, for example. All very interesting stuff. I also had the privilege of teaching for 20 odd years a subject that was referred to as advanced criminal law, which focused on criminal procedure. And important for our purposes, it was also focused on law reform. So I used to get students to do a law reform submissions, the same as what you're going to be doing this semester. They would have to write 5,000 word paper about a matter that was currently before a law reform commission in Australia, sometimes New Zealand is also, on a criminal law matter. You can see that there's a few areas here that relate to the subjects that we're going to be looking at during the course of this semester. Enough about my professional background. Personal background, you don't want to know too much. No, I guess like many people, I have some simple interests like things like bushwalking, food, wine, everybody loves these things. But perhaps my two quirkiest, if you like, areas that I've let you in on is that 2 or 3 times a week I do a Japanese martial art, Aikido. I train. It relaxes. You have to be in the moment. You get to switch off so that you're no longer thinking about law. And the other thing I like to do is go really, really fast on a mountain bike. I have 3 mountain bikes, cross country, a all mountain and enduro bike, and I really like to ride. That's probably my #1 thing that I do outside of law. Let's now turn to the area of skills that we're focusing on in this subject. The skills for legal graduates have been determined, or been over a number of years now. There's been committees established with the mandate of the federal government to say what skills law graduates should have. And this subject focuses on some of those important skills. Probably the most important skill, by the name of the subject itself tells you what that is. It's all about legal research. The volumes of law that exist now mean that people can't simply retain what are the laws within their head and walk around with like an encyclopedia about the law. That means they have to be able to research the law and find out how the law applies to client or questions about the law or requirements as far as businesses, etc., is concerned. So you need to have really good legal research skills. And that is one of the primary focus, or the primary focus, should I say, of this subject. And to be an effective lawyer, you really need to have good legal research skills. We're also going to be focusing on communication skills, of course. You have to be able to find the law, understand the law, and then communicate the law to others. So you have to have good communication skills. Now, we're primarily looking at written communication skills, but not exclusively. We're also going to look at sort of focus on oral skills. I want you to take every opportunity, particularly with in workshops or with your peers, to try and articulate what you know about the law. Now, it's not until you try to verbalize how legal principles apply that you suddenly realize whether you know how they apply or not. Quite often people think they know how they work, and then when they go to explain it to others, they can't do so, and in which case they need to go back and try and work out exactly how those legal principles apply. Critical legal thinking skills, or critical thinking skills, should I say. In other words, we're not just sort of trying to engage in a descriptive process where we describe the law here. We're looking at the law and how it applies in a broader context, and then we're evaluating whether that law should apply the way it does, what improvements can be made to the law, and how to make it more effective, if you like. The last area in terms of the sort of skills we're trying to foster through this subject, or develop, should I say, is reflective practices. So the ability to reflect on what you've studied, how you're doing it, and trying to improve yourself. This is an important skill, and this is the portfolios that you're asked to do really involves some reflective practices. Now let's turn to the area of assessment. Now I know you can all read the subject guide, so this is just me reinforcing what you've got to do. So let's just bring up a slide here, PowerPoint. Here we go. You can see that there are 3 pieces of assessment. You've got a research portfolio part 1. That consists of 2 parts, a weekly activity, or the weekly activities, and a research exercise. It's worth 30% and it's due on Friday, week 6. Now, the research activity consists of going to your weekly notes that you've been given, going to the part that's described as the module workshop, and there you'll find some exercises that are written in red ink. And they are your weekly activities. You perform those, you write when it's required to do so, and you provide those in week 6 for weeks. You do each week from week 1 to 5, and then you provide the total number of them, or all of them together in week 6, and that's the weekly activity component of the portfolio. There's also a research exercise. Here you've got a scenario, the types that you'd get in practice, and you've got to write 1,200 word answer to this. You've got the first one, so for the first portfolio, it's already available. You'll see that there's a criminal law focused question, which I wrote. Have a look at it, try and work out what are the issues involved here, and then write your answer. There is a good starting point. You're going to have to look at cases and legislation for this, but can I refer you to the book that is by Heather Douglas, myself, and Emma Higgins, called Criminal Procedure in Queensland, Chapter 2. Now, don't try and read all of Chapter 2. Just look at the question, work out what are the areas that are being the focus of that question, and then look at Chapter 2 and try and find the law as it relates to that particular issue that's before it. Because Chapter 2 is all about police powers, and you don't want to know all about police powers, but there are certain things you do want to know. So that's a good starting point. Just find as your starting point the issues have been to some extent addressed in that chapter. Okay, research portfolio part 2 follows exactly the same format. It's worth 30%. You've got to submit it in week 11. You have weekly activities, which are the same things I've described before. It's going to the modules, the workshop modules, following that red, the highlighted red requirements, and then writing it up each week and then producing it for week 11. So that's week 6 to 11 is the material that you have to provide in week 11. There is also a research exercise that comes with that. That is not yet available, but will be soon. So watch out for that. You don't need that yet because you're not going to start doing that until after you've finished and submitted week 6, the first portfolio. Then there's a major research paper, or which is referred to as a research project, which is worth 40% and ends due in week 12. We'll come back to that in a little while. I'll talk more about that because that's the law reform project. Now, the other thing to go and have a look at is there are 3 rubrics that are used for, they're available on the subject Moodle site. I say there are 3 rubrics, but really there are only 2. There's a copy of one rubric. It's an identical rubric provided for both portfolio part 1 and portfolio part 2. So that's the same rubric, but there is a different rubric that's provided for the research project. So just be aware of that. Now, I guess a couple of things that I finish off in relation to assessment. Firstly, you can see that the primary focus of all this assessment, there is one word that sticks out, and it's research. And I guess to put it succinctly, research well, do well. This is a subject about research. So if you research well, you should do well. The other point that I should point out is that at the beginning, I spent a little bit of time talking about myself. This wasn't just me going, look at me. Rather, I've given you some information about who your intended audience is. I'm the assessor, so I'm your intended audience when you're preparing your various pieces of assessment. Now, some of your assessment will say you're writing for your supervisor or you're writing for the law reform body that you're addressing. Now, in effect, we're all one in the same. What you had there is somebody who has a good understanding of the law. They're not just a client that doesn't understand the law at all. They actually do, and they want to know specifically about this particular legal issue. So that's your audience. Bear that in mind when you're writing. As I said before, when you're doing your portfolios, you have what's referred to as a research exercise. Those exercises are the types of exercises that you're likely to get in practice. It involves focusing on a particular area that is of interest to your client. And your client might be an individual or might be an organization. And when you're performing those tasks, you have a really important role to play here because your research is going to impact upon how that individual or organization prospers, if you like, or performs or operates. Or your research is important in that respect. So when you're doing that sort of research, you think, okay, I've got it. Let's say an individual, this person is reliant on me to get this right. Or if it's an organization, this organization needs to know this in order to function the way that it should. I guess I've always sort of suggested that one of the things you should ask yourself when you're doing this sort of research and you're writing it is to say simply, if I was the client, if it was me that was the client and somebody came along and presented my research and said, you've got to pay money for this, would I be willing to do so? In other words, when you're writing, think about the fact that you are selling a product, which is your research or the research outcome. Would I be willing to pay money for the quality of research that I have produced? to be a bit more dramatic, it could be a matter of, when you're talking about criminal law, of somebody going to jail. Would I be happy with this research effort if my freedom depended upon it? That's probably a little bit more dramatic, but you can get the point. Would my freedom, or going to, either I can walk free or I'm going to jail, may depend on the research that's being produced. So would I be happy with the amount of effort I have done when somebody's freedom is on the line? That's something you can think about when you're doing your research. Now, when it comes to law reform, which is your other topic, you're no longer looking at how it impacts upon individuals or organizations. You're now looking at how the law operates on the way society operates more broadly. Now, that makes it much more interesting and much more challenging. You're now going to say, look, this is how not just one client should be affected by the law, but how people in society generally should conduct their affairs. So embrace this opportunity to engage with law reform, thinking how important it is. Now, it's individuals, particularly, when I say individuals, I mean lawyers, engage in law reform in a number of ways. They may do it in their professional capacity. They may be a member of a professional organization, and they may therefore engage in law reform in that context. They may be a member of a community group. It's not uncommon, of course, for people to be engaged with their local communities, and that because you have legal expertise and they want the laws to change in some way, you will be the one that's probably leading the focus when it comes to the law reform. So there's a variety of ways in which you will, in a professional life, you become engaged in law reform. And I can tell you that as a legal academic, there was no bigger thrill than having my law reform submissions considered, and also in helping others with their law reform submissions to try and bring about change in the law. That is really quite an enjoyable thing. Now, the other thing I should say is don't try and cover the field. If, let's say, you're a member of a community group, or you're representing a company, or you're a government member or staff, should I say, you're a member of a government, from a government department, it's unlikely that you're going to be interested in everything about that law reform process. You're going to be focused on specific things that affect you. So therefore, you should take that same approach. Don't try and write I'm going to address everything that's being addressed by the law reform inquiry. Focus on what is of interest to you. That's what, of course, people do when they are engaged with law reform. I suggest that what that means is you've got to refine what it is you do. Now, having said that, remember that this assessment process is also about two things. It's about research and it's about legal knowledge. So when you refine it, don't refine it so it's all about something like statistics related to whatever. This is a legal subject. You are doing legal research. So it doesn't have to mean that entire output has to be about the law. You have to put it in context. But remember, it's a legal research subject. Okay, now, what is our topic? Well, it's one that's currently being considered by the Queensland Legal Affairs and Safety Committee. In particular, it's one that is focused on serious vilification and hate crimes. Now, I think you've got the terms of reference. I know you have got the terms of reference. I think you should have a look at those very soon and start working towards producing something. You can take one, if you look at the description of what the research involves, you've got one of three options. You can either draw up your own topic, as long as it's within the scope of the terms of reference of the committee. Alternatively, we have provided you with 3 topics. Now, they're not questions, they are just titles, if you like, and they are fairly broad. So in other words, again, don't try and say, well, somebody's produced a question for me, I've got to address every aspect of what they've addressed, put in that question. That's not what it is. It's given you a broad area that then you look at and go, I'm going to shape this and make this into my own area. That is one of the skills that we're focusing on in this subject, is the ability to refine things down and go, this is my topic, this is what I'm going to focus on. Now, you are given an option paper to start with, so I'd really highly recommend that you go off, read that options paper. It is not your typical legal document, though. It's got a great overview of the laws that are relevant here, and it's got the context in which they are important, but it's not your typical legal document, because if you look at the beginning of it, most of the organizations that are involved in that options paper are not legal in their focus. So just be careful, don't adopt their approach, the way that they address the law. For example, there's not a lot of citations or etc., and they're not justifying their position overly. If you want to see something that's much more legal and it's sort of on the same topic, I suggest you go to the Victorian Legal and Social Issues Committee's report on the same topic. Okay, that's me done by way of introduction. Look forward to seeing you in the workshops this week. Thank you.